Welcome, fellow GPEI colleagues, to the first nOPV2 webinar. My name is Rachel Lonsdale, and I'm a Senior Program Officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and a member of the nOPV2 Working Group. I'm going to go over a few quick housekeeping items before our program begins. First, another quick reminder to please join via the Zoom link or via the Zoom app on your smartphone, if possible, for an optimal meeting experience. Participants who have dialed in by phone will not have access to the interpretation or Q&A features. At the bottom of your screen are several icons. On the bottom right is interpretation. Please select either French or English to listen to the webinar in the language of your choice. Everyone except the presenters will be muted, and the chat function will be disabled during the presentation. This is to help us get through the presentation as efficiently as we can and to ensure that we have as much time as possible for the Q&A session. Please feel free to use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen to send questions at any time during the presentations, and we will answer as many of your questions as possible during the Q&A session at the end of the presentations. Also a note, you can type your questions in French or in English. Please note that everything that you put into the Q&A feature will be visible to our presenters, but not to the other meeting attendees. You can also choose to send questions anonymously. If you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the Q&A feature for this as well, and we will assist you as soon as we can. If you have dialed in by phone, please reach out to Anne-Marie, whose information is on the slide, and she will reach out to IT to support you. This webinar will be recorded in French and in English so that you can refer to it later and share it with colleagues who may not have been able to attend. Next slide, please. The objective of the meeting today is to bring GPEI colleagues together to share the most up-to-date information on nOPV2 and ensure colleagues are aware of the resources available to support country rollout. As you can see from the agenda, we have a lot to get through. I now invite our presenters to say hello and briefly introduce themselves in the order they are presenting before we dive into the presentations. Over to you first, Michelle.
Rachel, I'm losing your sound every now and then. I don't know whether this is the case for everybody else. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you, and apologies for the sound. Maybe if people want to comment in the Q&A if they had any issues or have any questions on the housekeeping items, but I can hear you okay. Thank you, Michelle.
Okay, I have difficulties hearing you, Rachel. Anyway, my name is Michel Zaffen. I'm the Director of Polio Eradication at WHO, and I also serve as the Chair of the Global Polio Eradication Initiative Strategy Committee.
Hello, good morning. My name is Ananda Bandyopadhyay. I'm a Senior Program Officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and I co-chair the Novel OPV Working Group of GPEI along with Simona. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Elizabeth Pietz. I'm a scientist in the Vaccines Assessment Group, which is part of the pre-qualification group within the Regulatory and Pre-qualification Group in WHO. And my main role is to work on the emergency issues listing work around nOPV2. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Simona Zapersky. I work with the WHO team out of Geneva, and I co-chair the nOPV2 working group with Ananda. Thank you all so much for joining today.
Good morning, good day, good afternoon. My name is Rustam Haidarov. I'm a Senior Communications Manager with UNICEF, and I'm co-chair of the Strategic Communication Working Group. And my role is to work on a team of communication professionals to create an enabling environment for nOPV vaccine introduction.
Hello, everyone. My name is Joe Swan. I'm a Communications Officer for WHO based in Geneva. And I'm co-leading the communications working stream of the nOPV2 working group.
Thanks, everyone. Next slide, and over to you, Michelle.
Thank you very much. let's go to the next slide, please. So I'm welcoming all of you, and thank you very much for joining this webinar. This is the first in a series that we're going to be doing to make sure that everybody is well informed of what we're doing with this novel oral polio vaccine type 2. This time we've invited only people that work for one of the GPEI agency, because we wanted you to feel comfortable asking questions and sort of raising concerns that, you know, and even challenging some of the answers that we provide, so that we have a frank discussion on this important development and this important vaccine. It is a critical time for the program, as you all know, for a number of reasons. And it is important that we actually have a good understanding and that we work together on making sure this novel nOPV type 2 is available. We thank you for your participation, and please feel free to ask any questions that you may have, you know, in the Q&A session. So as you see on this slide, the challenge with the program is facing has to do, apart from the wild poliovirus, with many outbreaks of CVDPV. And you know that CVDPVs occur when the strain of the poliovirus that is contained in the oral polio vaccine, which is weakened, starts circulating among populations that are under immunized with over a long period of time, and gradually it reverts to a form that can cause paralysis. The type 2 CVDPVs are the most prevalent form of VDPVs, and their frequency and scope have increased since the switch that was organized in April 2016 to move from trivalent oral polio vaccine to bivalent oral polio vaccine. This increase in CVDPV type 2 now presents a major challenge to our efforts to eradicate polio. Next slide, please. Now, why are we seeing outbreaks of CVDPV, and why do they continue to occur in the world? Of course, there are many types of VDPVs. Type 2, as I said, is the most frequent, but we also see type 1 or type 3. And all types of VDPVs basically occur because the population is not sufficiently immunized, and the routine immunization is too weak. But we're also seeing an increase of type 2 because the population immunity against type 2, and particularly the mucosal immunity against type 2, has waned tremendously since we switched from trivalent oral polio vaccine to type 2 bivalent oral polio vaccine. We also see migration of population, which actually lead to children being missed in vaccination campaigns. We probably have not conducted strong enough vaccination campaigns in response to the outbreak that first occurred. And we are using monovalent oral polio vaccine type 2 in these responses. And this, of course, carries the risk of seeding new outbreaks, in particular in areas of low immunization coverage. Next slide, please. Now, what is nOPV2? It's designed to actually sort of address the CVDPV and the vaccine-associated paralysis. This vaccine is a new tool. It has been genetically engineered to address the risk of CVDPVs in a way that sort of makes the vaccine more stable, basically. So we expect that the modification that have been done genetically to the vaccine strain will actually sort of reduce tremendously the risk of seeding new CVDPV type 2. And if it works the way that we expect, then this novel oral polio vaccine type 2 will actually be a full replacement of the monovalent oral polio vaccine type 2, which will in the future no longer be used. Next slide, please. nOPV2 is a major component of our strategy to eradicate polio. It is part of a sort of a very comprehensive strategy, which includes optimizing first, the outbreak response with the current tool, monovalent oral polio vaccine type 2. It is also sort of this strategy also includes strengthening routine immunization with IPV and ensuring that sufficient supply of all type 2 oral polio vaccine are available. During this period of the pandemic, we've actually paused, as you know, many activities, but we haven't stopped the efforts to ensure that the development and availability of the novel oral polio vaccine type 2 is sort of meeting our deadlines. We actually have continued to put a very high priority on these efforts so that we can have the vaccine reach a status where it can actually be granted an emergency use listing authorization so that it can be used by countries even before it is licensed. Next. So I will hand over now the floor to Ananda, who's going to basically take us through the more scientific details of the novel oral polio vaccine type 2. Over.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Next slide, please. So I'm gonna try to summarize around 3 years of clinical trial experience and data generation in 3 slides. So I'll try to go slow and, I understand there's a lot of information in these slides. So first of all, when it comes to novel OPV2 candidates, the journey essentially started back in 2011 when a scientific consortium, membered by CDC, NIBSC, universities like UCSF and other partners came together under the funding of the Gates Foundation to develop the novel OPV2 candidate strains. And post the successful preclinical development of these candidates, we launched into clinical development in 2017. Obviously, the issue around the clinical development process was we couldn't use the comparator vaccine, monovalent Sabin OPV2, concurrently in 2017 or later because the comparator vaccine was under containment, as you all know, post the global switch. So what we did in the clinical development program was to run a few comparator trials or historic control trials that you see on this slide as M1 and M2. Those trials were done in Belgium and Panama. These were done before the switch to generate comparator data with monovalent OPV2 to use those data when novel OPV2 candidate strains would be studied in clinical trials. And those clinical trials, as I said, began in 2017 with the phase 1 study under full containment conditions in Belgium. And then we moved on to phase 2 studies in Belgium and in Panama. So overall, the clinical trials with novel OPV2 covers 2 countries, 2 candidates of novel OPV2, 2 doses of those candidates, and finally 3 age groups. So you'll see adults in the Belgium studies and then toddlers 1 to 5-year-old and infants in the Panama study. The Panama study also was the study that was in the target age group meaning the target of the SIAs for polio outbreak response. And this was the study where we came to select the candidate that we would move forward with. And we now have 1 nOPV candidate that we have moved forward with for the manufacturing and for the regulatory purposes. This was also the study that helped us select the dose of nOPV2. The lower dose of nOPV2 was selected across the doses that we tested. And finally, the next study will be the phase 3 study in a larger population where we would gather additional safety data. But to sum up, this has been the journey so far for clinical development, multiple studies, phase 1 and phase 2, different age groups, different geographies and population, and finally leading on to a selected dose and a selected candidate of novel OPV2. Next slide, please. So this slide summarizes the kind of information that we generated from these clinical trials. So you'll see a range of different answers were gathered around the questions that we had. So the phase 1 study in Belgium ensured that we are confident around the vaccine candidates. These vaccine candidates were established as safe and also immunogenic in the population tested. And based on that experience, we moved on to larger studies without containment. And we essentially evaluated multiple endpoints covering general safety, immunogenicity, and genetic stability, which is evaluated post the shedding of the vaccine virus. So, and based on this overall clinical database, we are now preparing to launch into the phase 3 study, which we are planning to implement in the Gambia later this year. And that would again overall support the pre-qualification of the vaccine. The data that have been gathered so far through the phase 1 and the phase 2 trials, we believe would enable a review of the EUL processes that my colleague is going to talk about. I would also like to point out that in addition to the studies that have been done and the planned phase 3 study, we also plan to implement additional studies to inform policy around the use of the vaccine, which include safety and immunogenicity assessment in newborn infants, in polio vaccine naive infants, also studies to evaluate co-administration possibilities of novel OPV2 and bivalent OPV, and also evaluating administration of nOPV2 in campaign-like settings. So multiple policy issues and program issues we plan to address through these studies. Finally, the third slide summarizes what we have learned so far. So you'll see a range of different important endpoints have been addressed and important issues have been answered. So first of all, across these studies, when we look at the general safety and reactogenicity profile of this new vaccine, we didn't find any evidence of any increase of general safety or reactogenicity risk when it comes to novel OPV2 compared with the Sabin monovalent OPV2. Importantly, when it comes to immunogenicity assessed by seroresponses or seroconversion and seroprotection, we did establish that the novel OPV2 has non-inferior seroprotection rates and also equivalent seroconversion rates when it comes to comparison again with the monovalent OPV2. So essentially, these are no less immunogenic than the current vaccine. This was a very important point to establish through the clinical studies. When it comes to post-vaccine administration shedding, again, the overall picture was that the novel OPV2 pattern of shedding was equivalent and comparable to the post-MOPV2 shedding, although in the infant studies, the early data indicates in the high dose group that probably there is an earlier cessation of shedding in the nOPV population. So it seems like that the nOPV2 shedding is equivalent in the early post-administration phase, and then the shedding essentially it stops comparatively earlier than MOPV2 shedding. Lastly, and probably most importantly, when it comes to genetic stability of the vaccine, we went a step far beyond what a typical clinical trial would do, and we tested the shed and amplified vaccine virus through next-gen sequencing to evaluate genetic stability of the vaccines. And those tests did confirm that the reversions that we were expecting will not happen in nOPV2 really did not happen in this clinical trial sample. So essentially, the genetic engineering that has been done and the attenuations that have been done into the genome were holding in these vaccine candidates. And finally, when the shed and amplified virus was intraspinally inoculated in transgenic mice population, we saw very low or no paralysis rates in those mice population compared to very prompt and very high paralysis rate when it comes to the nOPV2 experience. So although there is no way to test this in human in small number of subjects, this gives a good indication that these vaccine candidates are indeed genetically significantly more stable and also phenotypically more stable, as evidenced by the very low or no paralysis rates. So that's where we stand when it comes to our data generation efforts when it comes to the novel OPV2 vaccines. And with that, I'll hand it over to my colleague, Elizabeth, to take us through the EUL processes. Thank you.
Good afternoon, good morning. My name is Elizabeth Plut. So I work in WHO in the pre-qualification vaccines, which is part of the regulation and pre-qualification department. And I'll be guiding you through the presentation on the emergency use listing. So the WHO pre-qualification department, it was set up many, many years ago in the 70s to respond to the need of procurement agencies and member states because they needed quality assured health products. So by creating and applying quality assurance mechanisms to be sure that what was procured by the procurement agencies was of good quality. And where as possible, WHO will rely on stringent regulatory authorities, or as they call them now also WHO listed authorities. So not all the work is being duplicated if it's done by regulatory authorities who have the capacity to do so. At the same time, based on the public health needs, WHO has started the risk-based, or the pre-qualification team, we have started the risk-based assessments, which are time limited. So this could be for licensed or pre-qualified vaccines for emergencies, such as the fractional doses in 2016 for the yellow fever outbreak in Africa, where the vaccine was licensed and pre-qualified. The emergency use listing, what is being applied to the procedure to nOPV2. Stockpiled vaccines such as smallpox and polio, nOPV2. The snake antivenom, and then there's other products. Next slide, please. So what have we done? So the collaboration with the between the pre-qualification department, the pre-qualification team, and polio has been going on for many, many years. So this is not something new, but it's really built up on what we've done before. My colleagues have pre-qualified vaccines, different presentations of polio vaccines, such as the monovalent and the bivalent vaccines, IPV vaccines. We've worked on the pre-qualification of nOPV2 and release into the stockpile. There was consultation with national regulatory authorities, consultations with manufacturers to make sure that this could move forward. And then now with novel polio vaccines, such as now facilitating access of novel oral polio vaccines, type 2, and the work we're doing then so on the regulatory preparedness activities, which include the revision of the EUL and the roadmap for implementation. So the EUL was set up in 2014, 2015 with the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. And next slide, please. It was set up as an evaluation procedure for medical products that are needed during a public health emergencies. This could be a public health emergency of international concern or a large public health emergency. It was again used also for UN procurement decision making and to support highly impacted countries in their regulatory decision making. That's what's the case in Ebola. It's a time-limited special procedure, so it's only for exceptional circumstances, and it's not to replace pre-qualification. So again, when it's a public health emergency and the situation warrants that a certain product is needed, then we can use it for initial response to an outbreak. So it's not for general use for every outbreak that you could think of or that's occurring. And it's really primarily used at the declaration of a FAIC, the public health emergency of international concern, which is the case with polio. And of course, the post-monitoring must be in place. Next slide, please. So what have we done specifically for nOPV2 in collaboration with the Global Polio Program and with experts? There was a discussion on the quality, safety, and efficacy with the manufacturers and the developers to see if this could start the assessment procedure. This was in November 2018 discussions, followed in May 2019 by large face-to-face meetings. Then based on the discussions and the EUL, we prepared a roadmap. The link will lead you to the roadmap where the whole procedure is described. Based on that, we then developed an assessment of a platform. So we, based on when you go to the link for the roadmap, you can also find the link to the EUL procedure. And part of it, the procedure is that we have to have a roster of independent experts who will be able to assess the vaccine. And they'll be looking at quality, clinical and non-clinical. So this was done as well. Then there was a consensus of the requirements, and I think my screen is not completely showing everything on the requirements and initial information. And also this was done. Next slide, please. Then the preparations for the assessment started. There was the first information package from the manufacturer was received in February 2020. The list of independent experts was established so they could review the information. They received the information. We had a face-to-face meeting and discussions in Geneva, and we invited also national regulatory authorities from impacted countries, whereas the different groups went through the quality, clinical and non-clinical data. In February 2020 also, we had a joint inspection in Indonesia at the manufacturer. And this was organized with the National Regulatory Authority of Indonesia. And they led the inspection with our colleagues and the experts that were participated along. Testing had to be done. However, with the COVID outbreak, this for now has been on hold because at this point, no testing can be done. And so there's discussions going on within the NRA how we can take this forward. Then there's the assessment of the preliminary data and interim recommendations. So all this assessment is going on. And then basically, once we have enough information, there'll either be there'll first be an interim recommendation and a final recommendation, again, depending on all the information available. And also with COVID, there's been delays with the clinical trials information coming back. And then also based on the assessments in the discussions with the manufacturer. Next slide, please. So the next step then, of course, is then the regulatory considerations for the countries. So during the expert review, we invited national regulatory authorities. Unfortunately, because of COVID, travel restrictions were put in place and not everybody was able to travel to Geneva to participate. And this is then an ongoing process, and this is what we're building on further. WHO, we will work very closely with the regulatory pre-qualification department. We will work very closely with the member states and the national regulatory authorities to facilitate the decision-making process. So the countries, it's the country who decides whether to, once the EUL is granted by WHO, the country will decide whether to accept the vaccine or not, but we will we'll work with them so they can make their decision. And this will then basically virtual meetings or face-to-face meetings with these NRAs. And this is based on, we'll start with a small group, and then Simona will go further into the details about the countries that are selected, and we're looking at the high priority countries first, and then expand to other countries as they become applicable. Next slide, please. So thank you for your attention. And I hand over the microphone to Simona for the next presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. This is Rachel, and just wanted to jump in with a quick reminder for participants to please ask any questions you might have at any point during the presentation using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and we will take those questions during the Q&A at the end. I've noticed a few hands up, but please just use the Q&A function and we'll be sure to get to those questions then. Thanks. Over to you, Simona.
Great. Thank you, Rachel, and thank you all for joining. Next slide, please, Emily. So as Ananda described, the data so far on nOPV2 is really promising and really encouraging, but he also highlighted at the bottom of his slide all the studies that still have to be done. And I think that that's an important point to highlight because there are a lot of questions that we haven't answered yet. And as we've been thinking through how to roll out nOPV2, we've really been trying to balance the risks of what we don't know versus the real need to get this vaccine out there and into use in countries quite quickly. And we've recognized that this is an important thing to think through because, in fact, any issues that arise with nOPV2 use would have an impact not just on the polio program, but could also have an impact on other immunization activities as well as on our organizations. So we do really want to make sure that we're thinking through and finding ways to balance these risks. Next slide. So in April, we presented to SAGE an initial use framework, which is exactly designed to do that. It's designed to balance the risk versus the need with rolling out nOPV2. And it does that by defining essential criteria that countries must meet during an initial use period, which we've defined as the first 3 months approximately after the EUL is granted. So after we get that EUL interim recommendation, the first 3 months during which we're using nOPV2 would be the initial use period. And we're estimating that we will likely do 1 to 3 full outbreak responses during that period. And we presented to SAGE a framework for how we would select countries during that period and what types of criteria those countries would have to meet. And that framework was endorsed by SAGE in principle, pending the EUL actually being granted. Next slide. You might be wondering what exactly are these initial use criteria, and luckily we have them for you here. So you'll see in the blue box at the top of the screen the 5 essential criteria that countries must meet to use nOPV2 during that initial use criteria. So they must have a BDPV2 detection, they must have the capacity to acquire and distribute the vaccine in a timely manner, and Elizabeth spoke to the need for countries to think about what would that expedited process be to allow for the approval for import and use of the vaccine. Countries need to be able to respond to any unanticipated findings. Those may be real, they may be rumors that spread, but we want to make sure that countries are able to rapidly respond to those, both from an epidemiological perspective as well as from a communications perspective. We also want to make sure that we're using this initial use period to gather the data that we need to allow for nOPV2 use more broadly when this period is over. And that means that countries must have good capacity for post-deployment surveillance. That's both so that we can identify any unanticipated events, but also so that we can gather data to confirm that the vaccine is behaving as expected. And then finally, due to the potential risk of recombination and due to the fact that we really want to be sure anything we're seeing is definitely linked to nOPV2 and not another vaccine, there would need to be a period of 12 weeks in between the last nOPV2 use in that area and the use of nOPV2. So that doesn't mean in the whole country, just in the specific area where we'll be using nOPV2. There are also some additional considerations like waiting 6 weeks after a BOPV2 campaign, thinking of issues like access or security, mostly in light of do we have any unanticipated findings and being able to respond quickly, issues of vaccine acceptance in the population, But there's also a few things that are quite important for us to think about in terms of the specifics of how that initial use happens. And one of those is particularly important as we think about what the restart looks like after the COVID pause Michelle mentioned. And that is that the first use of nOPV2 under EUL will have to happen with nOPV2 alone. And that's again, just to make sure that any events we're seeing are truly attributed to nOPV2 or not. We also will want to make sure there is sufficient vaccine to conduct the full required number of rounds. And we could consider IPV use later on, but not in the first 2 rounds where we're using nOPV2. Next. So what we then did is we took all of the countries that are identified at high risk of a VDPV2 transmission, and we tried to divide them into groups. And that isn't to say that one group is more important than the other or is the only group that could use nOPV2. It's really to help us within GPEI focus which countries we work with first in terms of preparing for the rollout of nOPV2. But it's quite important to highlight that any country that has a CVDPV2 outbreak and can meet the initial use criteria could use nOPV2 during that initial use period. So being in one group or another group doesn't affect your eligibility. It just affects where GPEI is focusing its resources. So we have identified 9 countries that are the countries at highest risk of a CVDPV2 outbreak and also meet our initial use criteria. Then we have another group of around 30 to 40 countries that we consider at high risk of a CVDPV2 outbreak. And then we have a remaining group of around 80 countries that are in regions where there are CVDPV2 outbreaks. And all of these groups are countries that we would, in an ideal world, love to work with right now to get ready for nOPV2 use. The more countries that know what nOPV2 is, have thought about their decision, do they or do they not want to use it, have started the preparations to do so, both from a regulatory perspective, but also a surveillance and post-monitoring perspective, the better for us. So if we had our choice, we would have every country start preparing now. But since we are limited both in time and resources, this stratification was just a way for us to focus which countries we work with first. Next slide. I'm sure you all want to know exactly which countries are where, so here is a quick breakdown for you. Of those 9 countries at highest risk, we have 5 in the African region: Burkina, Cameroon, Chad, Cote d'Ivoire, and Ethiopia. We have the Philippines in the Asia Pacific, and then we have Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Somalia in the Middle East and Asia region. In the second group of countries that are still at high risk for a CVDPV2 outbreak, and countries we would very much like to encourage to prepare for nOPV2 use and would like to discuss one-on-one how we could support these countries, there's 27 countries in the African region. You can see them footnoted at the bottom of the screen. And there's also several other countries in different parts of the world. And then finally, we have about 80 countries in the third group that are countries in or near regions with CVDPV2 outbreaks. And my apologies here, I have only used the WHO regions, which isn't to say that the UNICEF regions aren't important. It's just sometimes hard for me to map all the countries correctly. So we're looking here at the countries within AFRO, EMRO, WIPRO, and CRO, as well as within Euro, we've identified Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan at high risk. Next slide. So you may be wondering when these countries can access nOPV2. This is the highly anticipated slide and also slightly complicated. So if you look at the top half of your screen, you'll see what was our original optimistic timeline for nOPV2 rollout. And in that timeline, we were hoping that next month in July, we would potentially be able to have the first use of nOPV2. That will not be possible. In the inspection that Elizabeth spoke about, it was determined that the pilot plant doses that we were hoping to use for outbreak response are in fact best used only for studies. And so that means that we will therefore need to wait to get some additional testing and data from the commercial facility before we can get that interim EUL recommendation. And we hope to be able to submit all of those documents this month and have that data available in July. And what that means is if you look at the far right of your screen, you'll see that we're looking at a possible first use of nOPV2 for outbreak response in September. And then that we would have an approximately 3-month initial use period that would follow that. Again, subject to slight changes. But that's the timeline we're working on now, a possible first use in September. Next slide. How will we move forward with all of this? Well, the first step for us was to try and stratify the countries for engagement, what has been done. And now we wanted to get all of you up to date on where things are at. Ideally, you know, when all the world was in its pre-COVID state, we had planned a series of interactions at various TAG meetings and EPI manager meetings and different WR meetings and during the World Health Assembly, but of course that couldn't happen. And since we couldn't meet in person, we did want to take this opportunity to get your thoughts and answer any questions that you have before going further along. We are working though at the same time to develop some tools to support the national decision making, a technical guidance document, a country readiness assessment tool, and also an advocacy toolkit. And we want to have those ready in both English and French and eventually Arabic as well to support countries as they consider rolling out nOPV2, and then if they do decide to go ahead, to do so thoroughly. We're also working with across GPEI to update the existing SOPs for outbreak response and develop new tools as needed for nOPV2. The actual campaign is very similar to an mOPV2 campaign, so rather than starting from scratch, we want to take what's there and adapt as needed. Also, work is being done on a frontline worker training module, and that will be rolled out through a series of workshops. And once we have all of those somewhat done, we would like to schedule working calls with each WHO UNICEF regional team and across the GPEI partnership in the month of June, so this month, to go through country by country, those 40 odd countries we have identified at highest risk and in top priority for potential nOPV2 use. And look with the regional offices who really have the best sense of what's going on, more than we do anyways at global level, which countries would be interested and willing to start preparing for nOPV2 use. We know that certain countries have other priorities. They have different situations going on with COVID that make this something the government is or isn't willing to start discussing. And then if they are willing to go ahead with that, we would like to support the regions and the countries in the way they feel is best to move forward with nOPV2 use. And we learned from the IPV introduction experience that each region may have different preferences about how to best coordinate and support the countries depending on their context and capacity. And so we will have a cross-cutting team ready to support the regions, but we will follow the regional lead. And we also want to make sure we're looking at where there may be synergies with work that's ongoing for COVID. So, you know, for example, if countries are looking at rolling out a COVID vaccine also under an EUL, there may be synergies in terms of using nOPV2 or the process of rolling out nOPV2 as a pathfinder to help get those mechanisms really aligned and ready to go. Next slide. So I'll end today just with a few reminders. And the top line reminder is any country that's willing and interested should start preparing now for nOPV2 use. We, again, will work with the regional offices to map out ways to engage the relevant countries, but any country that can meet the initial use criteria and has a VDPV2 detection could be eligible to use nOPV2. There's no country that has been excluded as long as they can meet those initial use criteria and are eligible for a CVDPV2 response. And then finally, just to highlight that there's value in preparing now, even if you don't use nOPV2 during the initial use phase, because we are hoping that if everything goes well and nOPV2 performs as expected, it could eventually be rolled out for wider outbreak use. And so countries who have started this process now will be able to implement nOPV2 responses much more quickly in the future, should the need arise. That's it for me. Thanks. And I'll pass it over, I believe, with the next slide to Rustam.
Yes, thank you very much, Simona, and good day, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'd like to present the next 3 slides on behalf of the Strategic Communication Working Group, which brings together communication expertise across BMGF, Rotary, CDC, Gavi, WHO, and UNICEF communication teams, whose role is to pull together sort of thinking and resources to enable introduction of nOPV and support broader CVDPV response globally. So I'd like to present 3 things today. Briefly talk about the research that we've done to understand better potential risks of perceptions of risks related to nOPV introduction. I'll talk briefly about overarching strategic communication goals and I'll wrap it up with a couple of tools which would be available to the teams in the next steps in the process. So we've done a communication research to better understand what potential barriers or challenges may our audience face, and we've done it in Nigeria, DRC, and Kenya. And I'd like to thank colleagues both on WHO and UNICEF side and other partners who helped us to do this research. We've done this research among caregivers, basically 4 groups: frontline workers, health practitioners, and health journalists, to better understand what would we be dealing with. So from our understanding of the situation, where we built scenarios and we basically explained, what potentially may happen, and kind of imagined the scenario and asked the audiences and the groups what do they think, what did they think about it. So essentially on the caregivers side, what we know that caregivers, they don't really distinguish between vaccine-derived viruses or polio viruses. So there's really little technical information that we foresee there. At the same time, what we have found out that all of the pre-existing issues which caregivers had about polio vaccines, like repeated doses, multiple vaccine use, why certain vaccines cannot stop outbreaks, and also issues related to vaccine safety, they still exist. And so any communication related to that would kind of be overlaying on top of, any nOPV communication would be overlaying on that context. At the same time, we do not foresee, really bringing this whole issue of novelty out. And the thing is that, the new vaccine, so there are certain challenges which we foresee because it immediately raises question, what was wrong with an old vaccine? So we're looking into how do we position this vaccine as a part of the gradual evolution in the development, in the science of vaccines, and we'll speak more to that later. What we understand is the caregivers and health practitioners and frontline workers are essentially a very important group that needs to be convinced and need to fully support the vaccination and need to be fully aware of the vaccine. So essentially, caregivers will accept a vaccine if frontline workers and health practitioners provide sufficient support. What we also learned from the research that overall introduction of the new vaccine lays in sort of a broader concept, in a broader issue of overall trust. And the issue of trust in government efforts, the issue of trust in the COVID-19 and testing of the new vaccine in certain areas in Africa and parts of Pakistan, there were sort of all different types of media reports that already create some kind of uncertainty and suspicion about whether this new vaccine introduction, really would have something to do with the testing. So therefore, it would be important to ensure that we communicate around these issues accordingly. The fourth thing we learned is that frontline workers overall, they're pretty receptive about the idea of introducing new vaccine, and we've had experience with IPV introduction, and we've done this before, and it looks like there'll be a lot of acceptance. But what really frontline workers need, in our view, is assurances of vaccine safety and testing. So of course, the idea of emergency use listing and how we, the rigorousness of testing protocols and ensuring that they have that information at hand, particularly at their level. We have to strike a right balance between technical information and kind of information that we communicate to our frontline workers who not necessarily have a very robust health background. The fifth thing we learned was about the media. And it's very clear that journalists will have more access and will have more exposure to all sorts of technical information and expert information available globally. And therefore, it is important that that we use this, so we come up with appropriate kind of a global and local strategies to mitigate any issues around, around any issues related about anti-vaccination, about confidence in vaccine safety, and so certainly a lot of technical issues related to vaccine modification. So we have to be very careful how we position a sort of this issue in the public domain. Next slide, please.
Rustam, before you continue, I think there's some issues with your sound that you might have to try adjusting your headset.
Okay, let me just, if you can give me a second. And
Hello, Rachel, can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Okay, all right. Sorry about that. So in terms of the strategy, there are basically 5 strategic objectives. One is in terms of the, on the global scheme, therefore, it's important that we maintain global donor confidence in feasibility of eradication, particularly in the post-COVID context. And that largely comes around that novel OPV is new, it's important, we're really excited about this vaccine and we hope it works, and there's a lot of work and efforts been put into this process. So we really want to use this momentum in terms of bringing it as a game changer to control the DPVs. At the same time, we are looking into how could we sort of balance that global narrative and global strategy with creating sufficient vaccine acceptance on the ground. The second objective is which stems out from this research is creating frontline worker confidence in nOPV, and I already touched upon this. One thing we learned from the Brazzaville consultation in January, that generating scientific consensus and wide public health support of academia, health establishment, health practitioners, medical community, beyond just the Ministry of Health, beyond just sort of the advocacy efforts, would be really important with nOPV. And it's also one of the lessons learned from the IPV introduction, which we really would be focusing on. Ensure internal communication consistency, making sure that we as partnership, and there are a lot of players in the GPEI partners, ourselves at various levels are convinced and we have appropriate level of information to communicate, and we are confident about communicating about vaccine coherently. Last but not least, within the broader COVID context, dealing with infodemics and dealing with social and digital media and dealing with the pandemonium of rumors which we are seeing globally, being able to respond, first listen to them and certainly come up with the mitigation measures would be another big communication strategy and tactics. Next slide. So lastly, I'd like to say that how would we take this forward? So there are, the way we planned, and that what Simona mentioned, is we planned various types of interactions with the regions and countries. Now, we increasingly have to switch more online, and with that, we'll be looking into designing a 12-week kind of an online workshop program, which will be taking 2 or 3 hours each time with the regional and country offices from the priority countries, which will put together different curriculum, which includes external communication, crisis communication, response to IFI, frontline worker training, risk mitigation, social and digital media engagement. So all of those topics will be prototyped there with the regions and countries. So the way we foresee it is not developing it for the countries, but developing it with you, with the countries and with the regions. Therefore, participation of all Ministry of Health stakeholders, UNICEF, WHO, CDC, and all partners on the ground who really have presence on the ground to put together and develop integrated communication plans and certainly tools. Let me stop here and thank you very much. And apologies again for my sound.
Great, thanks, Rustam. Finally, we have Joe Swan, Communications Officer at WHO, who will talk about some available resources and upcoming activities before we turn to the Q&A session. Over to you, Joe.
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks, Rustam. Okay, yes, so before we head into the Q&A, we wanted to let you know about some of the resources on nOPV2 that are currently available for you to consult, as well as some resources that we and activities that are coming up soon. So the best way to do this is actually to walk you through the nOPV2 landing page on the GPEI website. So I'm going to take over screen sharing control, if I may. Emily, can you hear me? Excellent. Sorry, thank you. I think I've got it now. Sharing screen. All right. Okay, so now we're looking at the GPEI website. There's 2 primary ways to get to the nOPV2 page. The first one is actually if you go to Polio Today and then you see the vaccines, if you click on the plus button and expand down, you'll see OPV. Click on OPV. It'll take you to a page that details all the different types of OPV that the program is using. Scrolling down, we'll find nOPV2 here, and the read more will take you to the dedicated page on nOPV2. Another way to get to the nOPV2 page, which I'll pull up in a minute, is if you hover over library and then you see OPV new developments, click on the plus sign to expand, and you see nOPV2 here. Don't worry if you forget these steps. You can just do a Google search, or you can search through the website itself, nOPV2, and you'll find it very easily. Simply polioeradication.org/nOPV2 will take you there as well. So clicking on the page now. Okay, so this is the nOPV2 landing page, and I'll take you through some of the items, some of the resources we have listed here. Okay, so the first thing you'll see is general information. Under general information, we have a CVDPV2 nOPV2 fact sheet. This is available in English and French. I'll quickly open the English version to show you. All right, this is a tool that's intended for broad audiences. It gives an overview of the CVDPV2 situation and the strategy to control circulating vaccine-derived poliovirus type 2. We see here the current situation, gives a snapshot of cases in 2019. More information on the strategy itself, and underneath this you have information on nOPV2, as well as a sidebar on the EUL procedure. So this is it. Yes, this is for broad audiences. It's a great document for leave behind. It's a great leave behind document for meetings and such. It doesn't dig into too much detail, but it gives a good overview of nOPV2. So I'll close that. One resource that you should find quite handy is the frequently asked questions. So clicking on that, you'll see this page has drop-down capability. You see the question, click on the question, and you get the answer there. There are 3 categories of questions that we have on this page. We have general, so a lot of information that we've covered today will sit under there. We have regulatory, so you find more information on the regulatory pathway for nOPV2. A few questions on operations, and a question on COVID-19 and the implications of it on nOPV2 rollout. Down the bottom, there's information on VDPVs if you need it. So this will be updated as time progresses. As we come across new questions, we'll be populating this page. So watch this space. There'll be more content coming up on there soon. Okay, the next section of the website. So getting out of the FAQs. You'll see resources for countries. Now this is split. We've split this into 2 different areas, policy and technical information and tools. Under policy, you'll see several documents, including the WHO EB decision, urging member states to expedite processes for authorizing the use and importation of nOPV2 based on the EUL. You'll see you'll also see information on the WHO emergency use listing procedure. This links off to the WHO website for more information. And then you'll also see documentation, the SAGE conclusions and recommendations from April 2020. Under technical information and tools, you'll see the framework for initial use that was endorsed by SAGE. You'll see the roadmap for assessment of nOPV2 under the EUL, and a clinical summary. It's a short summary. It's about 3 or 4 pages of a summary of the clinical trial data on nOPV2. Okay, moving along, you see that we have a media center. This is where we'll house all our public GPEI statements and updates on nOPV2. You may have received, or you should have received a special edition of Polio News recently that had nOPV2 updates. You'll see that's contained in here. So any kind of public statements, press releases, media documents you'll find under this section here. Quickly moving along, publications. Under publications, we've got key peer-reviewed publications on nOPV2 since 2015. So they're all sitting there. Now, just quickly, we've got coordination and management. If you need to know any more, or if you want to know any more about the nOPV2 working group, you see here some information. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and go back to the presentation. Okay. Sorry, can we move to slide 35, please? Thank you. Okay, great. So in terms of resources that will go live soon, this month we're going to have a technical guidance document for countries. This is aimed at EPI managers / immunization managers to help facilitate country decision-making processes around using nOPV2. This will come with an accompanying PowerPoint presentation as well, a technical presentation. Another PowerPoint presentation will also be available. This will be more general for broad use. We're going to have some, well, any of the field documents that need to be updated for nOPV2 use. For example, standard operating procedures, these will go up online. Creative content such as an animation and infographic or infographics will go up online. And also an advocacy toolkit that will be intended for countries to use when approaching or discussing nOPV2 with Ministry of Health or government counterparts. In terms of C4D, we'll be including a link that links off to the Rhizome site. Some of you may be familiar with the Rhizome site, which currently houses all of the polio C4D materials. All the content on this page will be posted in their traditional locations, but also on the nOPV2 page. The idea to make it a one-stop shop for all the information that you may need. A key point on translation. Please note that we are prioritizing documents to be translated into French. We've had a request from our EMRO colleagues for documents to be translated into Arabic, and we're working to accommodate this. But at the moment, we're prioritizing French. Now, very quickly, upcoming events that will go live soon. So there will be working calls with regional teams that Simona referenced. There'll be communications workshops that Rustam spoke about, as well as our next webinar with all of you, hopefully. So we'll be sending out a survey next week to get your input on topics for the next webinar. Of course, please reach out to us if you have any suggestions for resources. And I'm going to finish there and pass back. Thank you very much.